Does anyone remember the Off-Broadway musical? You know, those small little musicals that used to run off-Broadway? What happened to them? Where are they now? I'll tell you where they are. They're on Broadway. Off-Broadway is in danger of falling apart because it's too busy going to Broadway. Let's look at some of the most recent musicals that played on Broadway. All of them from off-Broadway. What were they doing there? Passing Strange. Very original, small, quirky, unusual, maybe innovative musical. Played in a little tiny theater off Broadway, got good reviews, rushed it to Broadway, got excellent reviews, and it closed in 2 months. Why? It was an off-Broadway musical. It didn't belong on Broadway. Audiences were not happy with it. It just wasn't the right fit. Passing Strange, stay off Broadway. In the Heights, the very first Hispanic musical ever to come to Broadway. But does that make it a Broadway musical? It was very successful off-Broadway. Maybe it should have stayed there? Maybe it should have come to Broadway? It's doing pretty good business. I don't know. We'll give it a question mark. Maybe it's a Broadway musical. Grey Gardens, brilliant little musical. Wonderfully acted, beautifully written, tense, exciting. It was an off-Broadway musical. It was a perfect example. What did they do? Rewrote it, did not improve upon it, brought it to Broadway. It died in a couple of months. Grey Gardens, go back to off-Broadway. Spring Awakening, another off-Broadway musical that was considered innovative, very edgy, very on the cutting edge of what's going to happen. What's the first reaction? Bring it to Broadway. It's doing pretty good. It's been there for a couple of years. Maybe it's become a Broadway musical. We'll give it a question mark. The 25th Annual Putnam County Spelling Bee. Small little musical, came from regional theater, went to off-Broadway. Somebody said, hey, let's go to Broadway. But they did something smart. They put it in such a small theater, everybody thought they were off-Broadway, but they were on Broadway. Good move. Avenue Q, even more successful. An off-Broadway musical. It was a little satiric and edgy in its own way. It's on Broadway, and people keep coming to see it. Is it an off-Broadway musical? Well, it sure is happy on Broadway. Caroline or Change, probably the best musical on the whole list. What did it do? Played off-Broadway, got excellent reviews, rushed it to Broadway, where it closed in a few months. Why? Because it's an off-Broadway musical. It didn't belong on Broadway. And then the biggest hit of them all, Rent. Rent often opened off-Broadway and immediately went to New York and was a sensation. But the funny thing about Rent is, when you saw it in New York on Broadway, you felt like you were off-Broadway. Everything about the theater and the atmosphere said, this is not Broadway, this is the East Village. Good move. Rent deserved it. Rent is a Broadway musical. Why are all these shows coming to Broadway? Is it money? Is it awards? Prestige? I'm not sure exactly. A little bit of all. But the sad thing is, we don't have off-Broadway musicals anymore. We have musicals that are trying to get to Broadway. I say bring back the off-Broadway musical and let it stay off-Broadway.